How's it going, guys? It's Eclipse here, and today we look at quite possibly the worst tank within World of Tanks right now, and it's of course the EBR-75. We all thought that these were going to be one of the most broken tanks coming into World of Tanks and ruin the entire matchmaker, but to be honest with you, I think this was a complete waste of time by Wargaming, just a complete waste of dev time. Just there's no point in bringing these things in. How they currently are, they just don't work at all, and I just think that with a 30 FPS console especially, that most of you probably have if you have an Xbox One or a PS4 and you're playing World of Tanks, then it makes it even worse, these tanks, and they really are the biggest waste of money you can probably spend your time, money, and just basically everything about your gameplay within the game right now, playing the EBR-75 Emily 1954. And if the new tech tree is anything like this within the game, it is going to be something you want to entirely avoid. These tanks are just completely boring. They just cannot turn, as you're seeing on screen right now in the gameplay behind. They basically are just a tank line that, yes, you can turn in certain modes, but then it's like really the time, the control and stuff that you can have with these tanks, because you're not on a PC where you don't have your where you don't have the keyboard and you've got a bit more precision in what you're actually doing with a controller and joystick. It doesn't work whatsoever, at least in my opinion. Obviously some of you can still have fantastic games, and I'm not saying that you can never have a good game with these EBRs, because this game wasn't necessarily the worst game, but considering you're a tier 8 tank and it's still pretty bad, yeah, I just don't see the point in them. You can see here I'm using the kind of rapid or control mode where you can actually turn. Well, I say you can actually turn, you can just turn at a non-silly rate basically, and even then you're basically turning way too fast, so it's just too much for when you want to actually turn. And if you don't want, or you do actually kind of want to have a little bit of speed and be a light tank, then you're way too kind of slow at turning, so it kind of makes it pointless even having one of these when you could just play a traditional light tank. And although many people probably think that these things are still way too overpowered, you know, most light tanks can go 75 kilometers an hour anyway, and they don't have this problem with having terrible accuracy when they're in the fast mode, and they also then don't have the problem of kind of not being able to turn either, because, you know, when you can go 75 kilometers an hour and actually turn, then why would you ever play an EBR? Because they are just worse. They also have like very minor view range changes, so there's really no point, to be honest with you, in purchasing the EBR-75 Emily, which is obviously this tank right here. And I'm sure when the actual French wheeled light tanks come out on console, they'll be much the same. Am I complaining that, yeah, they're not overpowered or stuff like that? Well, no. What I'm kind of trying to highlight to you guys is that Wargaming spent a long time trying to develop these tanks, and they're basically a complete waste of time, at least in my opinion. Would have much rather seen development into things that kind of weren't controversial in the first place, not being the EBR line, and also just work on like the double barrel tanks or something else, because these tanks just, they're just not it. And certainly if you're wanting to actually play something that's super competitive and you're wanting to play light tanks, these French light tanks, these French wheeled light tanks, they're definitely not the way to go. Obviously you're seeing here in the gameplay, you know, we've had 1300 damage, and although, yeah, I've basically played in a way that has allowed me to do that, would have been just as well off if we just played in the AMX 1375, which obviously doesn't have these stupid mechanics which don't work on console. Obviously what they've tried to do is balance them, but I just think the whole concept of these tanks isn't balanceable, because if you try and make them balanced, you make them so unbalanced that they're just terrible, or alternatively if you give them what they need, they're way too overpowered, because, you know, basically what you're trying to say is they're an alternative to a light tank, but the only way you could make them better than a light tank is to just make them better than light tanks. So yeah, I just don't think that these work. Obviously leave your opinions, because I just don't know whether I'm getting the wrong end of the stick with these tanks, but when I've been playing them as pretty aggressive light tanks, you can't turn well enough to actually warrant being able to play them as an aggressive light tank, because you just don't turn. Maybe that will get better with the EBR, because maybe the top speed of the turnable movement isn't actually that bad. But yeah, currently they're just not it. And I just don't think that they really have enough within the game to kind of want to actually play them, and I certainly wouldn't recommend spending your money on any of them. It'll probably be bad enough just grinding through the tech tree lines, let alone actually grinding through and then purchasing them with actual money. Yes, certainly a tank I would 100% avoid ever paying money for. This tank is just not it, and hopefully Wargaming don't try and kind of force you guys to try and buy it. It really isn't a tank I would ever recommend to any of you guys. If you're wanting to play a light tank, definitely go and pick up a Vanguard. It's just 10 times better. Yes, this has a pretty nice actual kind of main armament, and you're able to actually deal damage when you can get that damage, but all of the other aspects of the tank are pretty terrible, so there's no real point. Obviously you're seeing here the mobility and the acceleration can kind of annoy other players, but you saw right there, yes, we avoided one shot, which you probably would have been able to do anyway with another light tank, but then you cannot turn, and then you try and see me like move out of the way of the Waffle Panzer IV, and it just doesn't work whatsoever. So just don't think that this is where you want to spend your money. This isn't where you want to spend your time when the full tech tree line comes out next week. Yeah, just keep your eyes peeled as to what you want to do with the amount of time, and certainly don't think that these are going to break the game and you're going to leave the game because these are overpowered tanks that you hate seeing within World of Tanks, because they just aren't overpowered in any regard whatsoever, and you'd be better off just kind of playing the game and actually just trying to take these tanks out, because yeah, if you're coming up against someone like me in this tank, you've got a much better chance if you're in something like a T-54 lightweight, like we showcased in how to take these tanks out and what tanks are going to be best to do that. You're seeing here, obviously you can make a slight turn with the handbrake, which you can utilise in these tanks, so that can make them a little bit more enjoyable, to say the least, so you can actually turn. But you're seeing here, this is the max turning speed. Terrible for a tank that is supposed to be reliable and turn around and use mobility, when, yeah, we weren't in the right drive mode, but if you turn into that other drive mode, you're not fast enough to actually avoid the shots which you're trying to do with these wheeled light tanks. So just a tank that, in my opinion, is not balanced, but they are kind of balanced because they're just that bad. So they're not good tanks. They're not ones you have to worry about in the matchmaker. If you're seeing people on the enemy team in these tanks and your team doesn't have any of them, trust me, it's a good thing, because they aren't good whatsoever. And you're going to see some gameplays here in the background whilst we kind of feature what these tanks are like, especially on a map that maybe isn't necessarily as good. So we're on the next game, which is on Erlenberg, and this is where you're really going to showcase the differences between if you were to play a traditional light tank and why you want to play traditional light tanks over these new wheeled light tanks in the game. And it's predominantly because, yeah, you're just way more flexible with the traditional light tanks. There's just so much more that you can do with those tanks that you can do with these tanks, but yeah, you're limited with these, so why on earth would you ever play them? They're not manoeuvrable whatsoever. It's like you can see here, me just trying to turn and make the angle better to be able to kind of focus the opponents that we're trying to aim at. It's even difficult to do that, so that's really where I don't think that you want to be using them. Obviously, you can get opportunistic with when you're activating your rapid mode, when you're activating your other mode. And you can see here when you're in the rapid mode, so maybe I want to get out of here if I get spotted early on in this game to be able to move out of the way. When I do that, the accuracy becomes really bad, so I'm not able to hit a Carnarvon that's sat there. Yeah, it's kind of like, do I swap to the mode where I can hit things, but pretty much being a sitting duck for most of the time, and although the wheels can help with avoiding a few shots, they don't help that much to the point where it really kind of makes it worth it just taking one of these over the traditional tanks, especially if you're playing in something like an AMX 1375, which is amazing, and you'd probably end up actually doing better in the 1375 than this tier 8 tank, which is basically a worse version. So there we go. I think that is really ultimately what the core differences are between them. You can see what we're doing here is obviously using a traditional light tank spot if the opponents haven't pushed into this area, and what we're trying to do in this sort of scenario is just put out damage whilst remaining undetected, which is super easy in these sort of tanks. Obviously they're very, very slim, very easy to remain concealed, and what we're using is these kind of advanced concealment as well as the view range perks to be able to use them kind of effectively against our opponents. You're seeing here, you know, yeah, we make a misplay by kind of staying here and going back up into the bush in just a second because the AT-15 is pre-firing, which is not a bad play from him. But you can see here the penetration is just terrible as well, so it's like just a double whammy really. We can get some assistance damage with these because you do have good view range, but as far as what Wargaming originally intended these tanks to be, as far as like being the super aggressive, you know, frontline fighters, you can't turn enough to be able to warrant you playing one of these as an aggressive fighter. So yeah, there's that, to be honest with you. And for the most part, you're going to be getting outgunned, outperformed by all of the other light tanks within the game currently. So there's really that to kind of think about when you're actually deciding maybe you want to play in one of these. Obviously the good thing about them is the speed at which you can reload, so you can still have good games, probably less so than your traditional tanks. And you can see here, when an actual tier 8 light tank comes around, you'll basically well underperform, or you're going to be way below the average against those. They have more hit points, they tend to be heavier, they can shoot on the move much more accurately, they can turn, and they have the same view range. So what is the point? And that is my question to you. Hopefully you guys can give some kind of opinion as to whether or not you think that these are worth actually playing, whether they're terrible, whether they really live up to the kind of expectation as to what World of Tanks PC have and the wheeled light tanks on that version, or whether, you know, you should just try and play these on console because they actually are balanced, or are they too unbalanced? Let me know in the comment section down below, and I hope you'll join me back for another video coming soon, and hopefully we can review the actual tech tree versions of the French wheeled light tanks coming soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.